Before dawn, the sound of knocking echoed through quiet suburban streets. 3 hard raps that froze hearts in mid-beat. Who were they coming for this time? In the blue half-light of Minneapolis, doorbells chimed like warning sirens as federal agents moved house to house, clipboards ready, eyes sharp. What began as whispers of an administrative audit had become something much larger. Operation Twin Shield, a synchronized strike across the Twin Cities targeting 1,000 names, 900 addresses, and one growing suspicion. America's immigration system had been quietly infiltrated from within. By sunrise, the raid was in full motion. USCIS officers, backed by ICE and the FBI, swept through neighborhoods with precision that felt military. 44 individuals were taken into immediate legal custody, while hundreds more were flagged for fraud or public safety concerns. Some were accused of forging death certificates to escape marriages. Others had lied about identities, even ties to overseas extremism. It was a reminder that paperwork, those mundane sheets of government trust, could hide entire criminal ecosystems. This was not a random sweep. It was a message. Under President Donald Trump's executive directive on homeland integrity, Operation Twin Shield was the first large-scale deployment of USCIS's expanded enforcement powers. Powers that critics once said the agency should never wield. But Trump's administration had shifted the rules. Bureaucracy was now a weapon. The mission? Cleanse the nation's immigration channels of deceit, one fraudulent signature at a time. Analysts from Reuters and The Guardian noted that the timing was no coincidence, with US intelligence increasingly worried about foreign infiltration through legal pathways, especially after the 2024 cyber attacks traced to Iran-linked groups. Domestic fraud cases suddenly looked like potential national security breaches. What if false paperwork didn't just hide illegal entry, but concealed operatives? This strategy of domestic vigilance mirrored patterns seen overseas. In Ukraine, counterintelligence units were cracking down on identity fraud networks tied to Russian sabotage groups. In Israel, digital verification was being fortified to screen refugees amid the escalating conflict with Iran. Even China had intensified its own population tracking systems under the guise of public order. Across continents, the balance between safety and freedom was shifting toward control. And now America was following suit, with Trump's government leading the charge. But inside those Minneapolis homes, the human cost was harder to ignore. Children woke to the sight of officers in black jackets. Neighbors whispered through half-open doors. For every legitimate arrest, there were families caught in the confusion. People who had waited years for citizenship, now terrified they'd be next. Still, the administration argued that integrity demanded discomfort. As USCIS Director Joseph Edlow told BBC News, every fraudulent case erodes the legitimacy of those who follow the law. Restoring order means facing hard truths. By nightfall, the Twin Cities had fallen silent again. Though few slept soundly, the message from Washington was unmistakable. America was no longer content to guard its borders. It would now guard its bureaucracy. The age of passive immigration oversight was over, replaced by dawn raids, data surveillance, and the cold certainty of accountability. Yet, they called it paper warfare. On desks inside the USCIS Minneapolis field office lay hundreds of files, each one a miniature battlefield. Names, fingerprints, bank transfers, love letters. Every line told a story, and every story hid a lie. Beneath the calm of administrative paperwork, agents uncovered a tangle of deception so intricate it rivaled criminal espionage. Marriage for green card rings, forged divorce decrees, death certificates bought for $100 online to erase unwanted spouses. It was not desperation. It was design. Among the cases was a Kenyan national who faked his own divorce while his real wife and 5 children lived just a few miles away. Another was the son of a known terror suspect who entered on a visa waiver, overstayed, and lied through a second identity. These weren't anomalies. They were patterns, and Operation Twin Shield's goal was to expose that pattern before it became an open wound in the nation's security fabric. Investigators compared notes with Reuters analysts and found that similar fraudulent pathways had been exploited in Europe's migration crises. In Germany, for instance, authorities dismantled a network using counterfeit Syrian documents to bypass asylum quotas. In Britain, marriage fraud had evolved into a billion-dollar underground business. America, once confident in its screening system, was now realizing it had inherited the same vulnerabilities. The Trump administration's response was to weaponize bureaucracy. USCIS, once a paper-pushing agency, was now trained to think like a counterintelligence unit. Forensic accountants traced financial records, while digital analysts combed through encrypted apps where sham couples arranged staged photographs for social media. The operation wasn't just punitive, it was diagnostic, dissecting the weaknesses of a system that trusted paper more than people. Critics from Al Jazeera and The Guardian raised alarms over what they called administrative militarization. Was this a safeguard against fraud or a shadow campaign against immigrants? The question cut deep, but Trump's officials countered that fraud wasn't a victimless crime. Each fraudulent marriage meant one genuine applicant delayed. Each fake asylum plea meant one true refugee left waiting in danger. Justice, they argued, demanded precision and sometimes confrontation. Meanwhile, defense analysts at Janes and Defense News drew an unexpected parallel. The precision of Operation Twin Shield resembled counterterrorism tactics once used overseas. Raids coordinated by data, decisions driven by algorithms. The US had exported such tactics to Baghdad and Kabul. Now it was importing them home. The frontier is no longer geographic, one expert told DW, it's bureaucratic. This new frontier had echoes around the world. In Ukraine, digital citizenship systems helped root out infiltration attempts by Russian agents posing as refugees. In Israel, database integration was being used to identify Iranian intermediaries in visa applications. China, ever watchful, used similar digital fingerprinting to suppress dissent. America's crackdown looked, to some observers, like a democratic nation reluctantly borrowing the methods of its rivals. Inside USCIS headquarters, however, the message was simpler: integrity or collapse. Officers whispered that Twin Shield was only Phase 1. Phase 2 would merge federal and state databases, giving Washington real-time visibility into every immigration case. But behind the efficiency and enforcement, a more human question lingered. How many legitimate lives would be swept up in the dragnet before justice could separate truth from error? When President Donald Trump signed Executive Order 14,161, the pen didn't just mark paper, it redrew the boundary between liberty and enforcement. The order, titled Restoring Integrity and Securing the Homeland, granted USCIS new investigative authority long reserved for ICE and the FBI. No longer was the agency a passive reviewer of applications. It became a frontline enforcer, empowered to raid, detain, and prosecute. To supporters, this was the long-awaited correction of a broken system. To critics, it was the dawn of an era where administrative discretion could feel like surveillance. The policy pivot reflected Trump's broader security doctrine: fortify from within. As BBC News reported, the White House strategy was clear: rebuild institutional credibility, eliminate systemic fraud, and reestablish public faith that immigration was a privilege earned, not a loophole exploited. The decision came after years of quiet warnings from DHS auditors who had documented rising rates of document forgery, visa overstays, and asylum manipulation across multiple states. But Reuters' analysis added a deeper layer. The move wasn't just domestic, it was geopolitical. As the United States reinforced its internal vetting, it was also pressuring allies in NATO and the EU to tighten their own systems. Washington feared that weak migration controls abroad could become conduits for security threats that would eventually reach American soil. Integrity at home begins with discipline among allies, one DHS strategist told Defense News. Behind closed doors, the transformation of USCIS had the precision of a military reform. Director Joseph Edlow oversaw a restructuring that placed field offices under a new Enforcement Coordination Division. Former ICE and FBI specialists trained USCIS officers in surveillance detection, data correlation, and deception profiling. Within months, the once civilian branch resembled a law enforcement hybrid, its digital arm equipped with predictive algorithms capable of flagging anomalies in real time. Meanwhile, international observers watched the US model spread. In Kiev, the Ukrainian Ministry of Interior studied Twin Shield's methods to combat infiltration by Russian saboteurs using falsified EU documentation. In Tel Aviv, Israeli cyber units mirrored the data verification framework to counter Iranian sleeper cells posing as migrant laborers. And in Beijing, the Communist Party's state media accused Washington of mimicking Chinese security bureaucracy while ironically expanding its own biometric oversight. The irony was unmistakable. Every major power was fortifying its borders digitally while warning others against doing the same. In this new age, paperwork had become a battlefield and trust a strategic resource. Still, human stories broke through the policy fog. Among those questioned in Minneapolis was a retired nurse from Liberia who had lived in the US for 19 years, her citizenship pending due to lost records in a war-torn archive. Her fear wasn't guilt, but uncertainty. If the system demanded perfection, what chance did the imperfect have? Trump's defenders insisted the executive order was never about exclusion, but restoration. The American dream, Edlow said in a DW interview, belongs to those who honor the process, not manipulate it. Yet the question that haunted policymakers remained: can integrity be legislated without hardening into suspicion? As America redefines the limits of trust, the world watches a democracy testing the sharpest edge of its own ideals. Inside a converted federal operations center on the outskirts of St. Paul, the walls glowed with digital maps, each dot a potential fraud case, each connection a thread in a national web. USCIS, ICE, and the FBI worked shoulder to shoulder under the fluorescent hum, their coordination so seamless it resembled a wartime command post. Operation Twin Shield wasn't about brute force, it was about information warfare. The enemy wasn't soldiers, it was deception itself. Analysts described it as a new kind of battlefield: digital fingerprints instead of gunfire, data trails instead of contraband. Using AI-driven analytics designed in collaboration with defense news contractors, agents could now detect inconsistencies between visa records, tax filings, and marriage certificates in seconds. These systems, once used to track terrorist financing overseas, were repurposed to expose domestic fraud networks hiding in plain sight. The sophistication startled even seasoned investigators. False identities were stitched together using deepfake photographs, forged certificates, and cross-state aliases. In one case, a criminal syndicate had sold immigration packages, complete with falsified birth records and doctored social media profiles for clients seeking asylum. When federal teams traced the digital footprint, they uncovered links to a transnational forgery ring operating through Dubai and Eastern Europe. What began as an American paperwork case had mutated into a global criminal economy. Officials from Reuters and The Guardian noted how the United States was now blending intelligence tactics once reserved for foreign adversaries into domestic operations. Trump's directive allowed interagency intelligence sharing at unprecedented speed. Critics feared it blurred civil boundaries. Supporters argued it finally gave agents the tools to protect the country from within. Parallels emerged overseas. In Ukraine, joint cyber units employed similar methods to track Russian disinformation accounts spreading chaos through refugee networks. In Israel, biometric tracking programs, developed during its ongoing tension with Iran, had reduced visa fraud by 38%. Even China's security apparatus, often condemned for overreach, was quietly praised by some US analysts for its technical efficiency in identifying synthetic identities. The line between vigilance and intrusion had never looked thinner. For agents inside the Twin Shield Task Force, however, the mission felt personal. Many had spent years watching criminals exploit bureaucratic loopholes, watching good applicants wait while liars advanced. One ICE officer, speaking anonymously to DW, described the raids as surgical justice, swift, targeted, and overdue. But another, more cautious voice within USCIS admitted, "We're chasing ghosts through paperwork. One false hit could destroy an innocent life." That duality, precision versus peril, defined the operation's character. The FBI's behavioral analysts even adapted counter-espionage profiling methods to anticipate deception during interviews. Each facial twitch, each pause in testimony became a data point. Technology quantified trust. Beyond the immediate cases, Washington saw a deeper test unfolding. Could American institutions reclaim authority in an era when truth itself felt negotiable? The outcome would ripple globally. Europe's border agencies were studying the Minneapolis model. NATO's cyber divisions were exploring integration of civilian fraud analytics. And allies from Poland to Australia signaled interest in replicating the US data sharing structure. Yet amid the strategic triumphs, one haunting image lingered. A child clutching her mother's arm as agents searched their home for proof of a sham marriage. She asked if her mother was one of the bad ones. No algorithm could answer that question. As America's systems grew smarter, its moral questions grew heavier. The state was learning to see everything, except where justice ends and empathy begins. Within weeks, Operation Twin Shield became more than an enforcement drive. It became a national prototype. From Dallas to Detroit, from Miami to Seattle, new task forces began mirroring the Minneapolis model, combining intelligence-grade analytics with ground-level coordination between USCIS, ICE, and local police. What had started as a regional experiment was now evolving into a federal doctrine. President Donald Trump praised the mission in a televised briefing, calling it a blueprint for integrity across all 50 states. Behind him, charts displayed arrests, referrals, and data verifications completed since the operation began. Proof, his administration said, that the immigration system could finally defend itself. "No nation survives without honesty," Trump declared, echoing the tone of wartime resilience. The success was undeniable, but so was the unease. Civil rights groups warned that data sharing protocols risked violating privacy laws, while local mayors feared a chilling effect in immigrant communities. Reports from The Guardian described how families canceled routine USCIS appointments out of fear that a paperwork review could turn into a home raid. In Minneapolis, once hailed for its immigrant-friendly policies, attendance at citizenship clinics dropped by nearly 40%. The air was thick with uncertainty. Was this vigilance or intimidation? Yet in Washington's strategic calculus, the stakes were larger than fear. Homeland Security analysts argued that every fraudulent visa corrected meant one less potential security breach. Intelligence units cited cases where forged identities had been used by drug cartels and, in isolated instances, by suspected foreign operatives. To them, the cost of inaction outweighed the discomfort of scrutiny. The transformation resonated beyond US borders. In Europe, the EU's Frontex agency reportedly studied the Twin Shield framework to detect transnational marriage scams linked to human trafficking. DW noted that Germany's Interior Ministry praised the US operation for its systemic thoroughness, though it stopped short of adopting identical tactics due to privacy concerns. Meanwhile, Israel quietly integrated elements of the model into its anti-infiltration programs along the Negev border, tracking foreign actors posing as construction workers, an effort shaped by lessons from its confrontation with Iranian proxy cells. The ripple even reached the Pacific. In Beijing, state media portrayed Twin Shield as confirmation that America was finally acknowledging the necessity of comprehensive population monitoring, though Western observers noted the irony. China's surveillance state was the very model America claimed to reject. The global divide between democracy and control was shrinking, not widening. Still, the operation's architects framed it as moral correction, not suppression. Integrity is not surveillance, it's fairness, USCIS Director Ed Lowe told BBC News. Those who cheat the system steal from those who obey it. To many Americans weary of bureaucratic chaos, his words resonated. Trust, long eroded by political division, seemed momentarily restorable through action. But community leaders in Minneapolis offered a quieter warning. As one pastor told Al Jazeera, When you protect the law so tightly that people are afraid to approach it, the law itself becomes a wall. By mid-autumn, Operation Twin Shield had shifted from emergency action to national strategy. Congress prepared hearings on expanding its budget, while advocacy groups filed petitions demanding oversight. The debate no longer centered on fraud, it centered on identity. What kind of country was America becoming? One that opens its doors with caution, or one that locks them with pride? And if the Minneapolis model spread from coast to coast, could the same machinery built to protect integrity someday be turned towards something far more personal? By winter, the echoes of Operation Twin Shield reached far beyond Minnesota. What began as a local crackdown had evolved into a moral crossroads for the nation. The statistics were impressive. Hundreds of cases resolved, millions saved in fraudulent benefits. But numbers couldn't hide the growing debate beneath the surface. How far should America go to secure itself from within? On Capitol Hill, Trump's advisors hailed the operation as the keystone of homeland renewal, arguing that restoring integrity to the immigration system would reinforce America's credibility abroad. In private meetings reported by Reuters, strategists described it as a countermeasure not only against fraud, but against hybrid warfare, a term borrowed from NATO analysts studying Russia's manipulation of migration flows in Europe. By targeting domestic vulnerabilities, the White House hoped to shield the U.S. from the same destabilization tactics seen on Europe's borders. Yet, among allies, the tone was mixed. In Brussels, EU officials quietly debated whether the American model blurred civil and criminal authority too deeply. DW commentary noted that Germany, while impressed by the operation's data precision, warned of a thin constitutional ice. In London, policy experts saw it differently. The US is building resilience through accountability, a former MI5 analyst told The Guardian. But resilience without restraint becomes control. That tension, security versus liberty, now defined the Trump era's immigration philosophy. The administration framed it as strength through discipline. Opponents saw it as discipline through fear. Globally, the effects were unmistakable. Ukraine's security service adopted portions of the US verification model to detect Russian agents posing as humanitarian volunteers in Odessa. Israel expanded its human intelligence vetting of refugee entries from Lebanon, citing lessons learned from Twin Shield's fusion of biometric data and behavioral analysis. Even Iran's state media, Press TV, framed the operation as evidence of Western hypocrisy, proof that America's democracy now walks the same line as its adversaries. Inside the US, the human toll continued to ripple. Some who had lived quietly for decades suddenly found their lives under audit. College students on expired visas, widows waiting on appeals, asylum seekers without translators. Each faced an institution more efficient but less forgiving. Community advocates described a rising administrative anxiety, the fear not of deportation, but of misunderstanding. For law enforcement, though, Twin Shield was a model of success. Fraudulent marriages were down by nearly 30% nationwide. The USCIS backlog had shrunk. Data fusion centers once used for counterterrorism were now clearing months of fraudulent petitions in hours. On paper, the system worked, but beneath the triumph, a larger question loomed. Every government that fortifies its integrity eventually confronts the same dilemma. What happens when vigilance becomes the new normal? Does a nation that learns to see every lie risk forgetting how to trust? As dusk settled over the Twin Cities months after the raids, the streets looked unchanged. Yet in the silence after the knock, America had crossed a threshold toward a future where every form, every file, every fingerprint carried not just identity, but intent. The world was watching whether that future would be built on fear or on faith. Because in a nation that prides itself on freedom, the hardest truth remains the simplest. Sometimes the greatest threat to liberty comes not from the outside, but from the zeal to protect it. Operation Twin Shield marked a turning point in America's immigration enforcement under President Donald Trump. Launched in Minneapolis, the mission exposed widespread document fraud, sham marriages, and links to transnational networks. Backed by Executive Order 14,161, it transformed USCIS from a paperwork processor into an active enforcement agency, merging digital surveillance with traditional investigation. Supporters saw it as a restoration of national integrity. Critics warned of creeping authoritarianism masked as reform. The model spread nationwide, influencing global security policies from Ukraine to Israel. Yet the deeper conflict persisted. America's pursuit of purity in process versus its promise of openness. With AI-driven analytics and interagency cooperation, the system became faster, smarter, and colder. TwinShield's legacy is not only its efficiency, but its question to the world. How much freedom should be traded for safety? The knock at dawn in Minneapolis may have ended the era of bureaucratic complacency, but it also began a new one, where security and liberty stand in constant tension, and every decision echoes far beyond the paperwork it seeks to protect.